When you walk across the bridge over the Clyde River running through the village of Clyde, New York, there isn't much to listen to. The occasional car, the even more occasional horse and buggy, the birds, the Amtrak, and a couple times an hour, a freight train. But not so long ago, the river was host to barges densely populating the Erie Canal. Railroad tracks flanked both sides of the river, and bustling stores and factories were here to tap the flow of goods and people coming to and from the town. Among those businesses was an array of mills essential for refining the various agricultural products of the surrounding area. My name is Benedict Wright, and this is Millstone, a podcast about one of those mills, one that was operated by my great-grandfather, George Ketchum, and his father, Alfred, before him. The story of the Ketchum Mill, as with the other mills and manufactories of Clyde, reflects the changing needs and conditions of the village of Clyde and its surroundings. When the mill was first established around 1909, under the moniker Burke and Malloy and a year later Ketchum and Malloy, the village of Clyde, like many other places in rural America, was already riding a wave of steady agricultural improvements and increases in productivity, saving human and animal labor with new machines and fossil fuels. By the time the mill closed in 1973, that wave of improvements had grown into a storm of transformations. The Ketchum & Son Mill, as it was then called, was the last of its kind in Clyde, as the need for a personal feed grinder had been largely eliminated from the commercial agricultural economy. Fortunately for me, George Ketchum donated the mill to the Galen Historical Society when it was formed in 1976, and many of the interior mechanisms are still intact and visible. Part family history, this podcast explores the lives and stories of my relatives, ancestors, and their neighbors. Part oral history, it seeks to preserve and encounter the voices of generations whose world I can never see firsthand. And part economic and agricultural history, it's an attempt to situate the Ketchum Mill in its context in a period that can only be described as revolutionary in terms of technology and policy. It's a period that unmistakably shaped the way Clyde looks and sounds today.
I'd like to go down to visit, and it was usually on a Saturday. I remember they had a scales that the trucks come in and would weigh, I remember that. And I remember Mrs. Burdick, she was the secretary, and I knew that they sold paint besides selling coal. And there was the farmers would bring in the grains and stuff to be done in the mill.
The rodents were terrible all over because of the grain. Rats and all kinds of things in the mill part.
And we always would go down to the mill to visit and see what was going on. I was more fascinated by the machinery than I was anything else almost, because it was just a whole new world for me, no two ways about it. And I remember Grandma always warning Grandpa to make sure I stayed out of mischief and didn't get into any trouble.
You take your grain in and grind it, and then they had Purina Chow, and then they had put in they had a molasses machine, and that must still be in there, I don't know. That's what made Clyde the way it was the farmers, it was all farmers, or they worked on farms.
I tell you, back then most of the farmers grew what they needed to grow for their own farm. Because it wasn't a thing that you would grow a lot of stuff to sell. Most of them grew what they used on their own farm.
Once they went to cash crops, where the bigger farmers, they ended up growing corn and oats or whatever and selling everything. They didn't use any of that for feed. They just bought the feed ready-made from a big mill like Purina or somebody that would bring it out and blow it in their barn. Instead of growing grain for their own feed, they were growing grain now as a cash crop.
There's been a lot of years where most of the years, prices have been down, and farmers just They go right back at it.
Keep growing it.
Because
hopefully we'll make money next year.
they're the most optimistic people around, and I'm one of them.
I've seen a lot of things change in my life from 1942 when I was born up to now. It's just mind-boggling.
I just picture Clyde like it used to be, with all the people and the Saturday night. That was a long, long time ago, of course. But
The Main Street, empty buildings. It just seemed when I was a kid, it was so much more alive, and the town was productive, and it's really changed a lot.
So we don't have a movie theater. We don't have a train station. We used to have 2 train stations here in Clyde, one on each side of the river. And of course the retail has shrunk. That obviously changes the look of downtown, and people will say that means we've gone backward. I would contest that. We look different, but that doesn't mean we have gone backward as a community. It's just that we need to show community in maybe some different ways.
That last person you heard is Hugh Miner. He's a former teacher and newspaper editor, and today he is the official Galen and Clyde historian. He's done invaluable research, and he has been essential for convincing folks to talk with us. I suspect far better than I, a long-lost Clyde expatriate, ever could have. Together, Hugh and I have been discovering what made the mills of Clyde tick, and why today there isn't one and hasn't been one for almost 50 years. According to earlier histories of Clyde, milling, originally powered by water or animal power, was one of the first industries in the village. As more settlers came westward in the decades following the American Revolution, clearing forests and establishing farms, there was an increasing need to process wood into lumber and grain into flour or feed for human and animal consumption. The close connection between agriculture and milling will continue hand in hand throughout our story. As farms change, mills change. And in the 20th century, as farms grow larger and consolidate, so do mills. When white settlers arrived, the Clyde area was no stranger to agriculture. Far from an untouched wilderness, the land that is today central New York had been farmed for centuries by indigenous people, including the Onondaga, Seneca, Cayuga, and Oneida nations. The primary cultivated crops being corn, beans, and squash. However, as settlers displaced indigenous Americans and dispossessed them of their land, the settlers subdued the land to a new degree, aided by iron tools and beasts of burden. By the 1850s, the Erie Canal had been dug through Clyde. The first locomotives were pulling train cars to and from town. Mills with steam engines were popping up rapidly, and new machines were changing the face of agriculture around Clyde and across the United States. These developments in transportation and technology drew businesses and trades to the growing village. According to one history, bear with me on this long quote, in 1856, Clyde contained 11 dry goods stores, 1 provision store, 15 groceries, 3 clothing stores, 2 tailors, 4 shoe shops, 2 harness shops, 5 milliners, 1 dressmaker, 1 hat store, a jeweler, 1 bookstore, 1 bazaar, 3 cabinet shops, 1 hardware store, 4 stove shops, 2 tin shops, 3 drug stores, 6 meat markets, 4 hotels, a billiard room, a ball alley, 1 distillery, 2 flour mills, 1 sawmill, 1 carding machine, a printing office and weekly newspaper, 2 planing machines, a furnace and machine shop, 1 rectifying house, 2 sash and blind manufactories, a brewery, 4 forwarding houses, 2 builders, a lumber yard, 1 brick yard, the glass works, 4 cooper shops, 2 artists, 2 Daguerrean artists, 4 painters, 4 blacksmiths, 1 stave machine, 1 wagon manufactory, a malt house, a boat yard, 1 ashery, 2 bakeries, 1 coach lace manufactory, a tannery, a barber shop, 1 dentist, dentist, 5 surgeons, 4 lawyers, 1 bank, 4 livery stables, 1 brass band, 1 concert hall, a high school, 2 select schools, 6 churches, an agricultural society, and between 50 and 100 carpenters and stonemasons kept in constant employment." End quote. Through the remainder of the 19th century, the milling of grain into grist or flour remained a staple business in the village and an essential service for farmers. At the same time, malt houses, buildings that soaked and sprouted grains for the making of beer and whiskey, were a common sight, and they served a similar function to mills in that they processed and added value to grains. In 1876, near the peak of Clyde's population with over 3,000 people, the village supported 7 malt houses and 2 grist mills. Over the following decades, emphasis shifted from malt houses and more onto feeds to support the growing New York dairy industry. By the time my bespectacled great-great-grandfather, Alfred Ketchum, joined Daniel Malloy's coal, cooperage, and feed business around 1910, the last malt house had been shuttered. When I first visited the mill that now houses one of the Galen Historical Society's museums, a 3-floored building filled with chutes, tubes, control panels, and contraptions, I wanted to know how this building actually worked. What would it have felt like inside? Who was needed to operate it? And what function did it perform in the community? And why was that function largely obsolete by the 1970s? In the next episode of Millstone, a production of the Galen Historical Society, we'll hear from the current and former residents who helped Hugh and me answer these questions.